afternoon, everyone. Welcome back from lunch. I hope you enjoyed your break and the food that was provided. You are in for a real treat today. And before I introduce our speaker, I just have a couple announcements. Again, my name is Ashley Harnett. I'm one of the consultants. There's going to be a few other consultants in the room. They have red staff badges on. If you need anything, have any questions, please feel free. We are going to be kind of interspersed throughout the room, but if you need anything during the break or during this session, please do not hesitate to reach out. Also, a heads up that this session is being live streamed, so please make sure that you silence your phone. Let's do our best to keep any comments or chatter to a minimum. If you do need to leave the room for anything, it's no problem at all, but just know that this session is live. This session will be engaging and interactive, and so if you have any questions, any comments, I know that Tim is gonna give you some expectations throughout the session as well. We're gonna have microphones for you to, again, ask any questions throughout the presentation, so please engage with us throughout this talk. Also, just a heads up, the exhibit hall is open until 5. Quiet rooms are in room 113 and 114. We have a nursing room available in 116. If you're interested in giving a little shout out to the conference about your experience, any testimonies, anything that you learned from the conference, if you could stop by the Patent Pod room, that's room 115. Also, want to give a little plug for the closing keynote. That will be following this session starting at 4:30, from 4:30 to 5:30. Janet Twyman will be presenting on why you should become a behavioral educator. It will be in the President's Hall. Don't forget that we need that yellow neon form that you've been writing down all of your codes. Please drop that off at the registration table so that you get your credits. You can access this presentation on the NAC website where you registered for the session, as well as the Sketch app. And also feedback. Don't forget to provide us feedback on the conference, as well as this session and any session that you attended. So it is my great honor to introduce the presenter today. Tim Hackenberg received a BA in psychology from the University of California, Irvine, in 1982, and a doctorate in psychology from Temple University in 1987 under the supervision of Philip Heinlein. He held a postdoctoral research position at the University of Minnesota with Travis Thompson from 1988 to 1990. He served on the faculty in the behavior analysis program at the University of Florida from 1990 to 2009, and is currently a professor of psychology at Reed College in Portland, Oregon. He has served on the board of directors for both the Society of the Experimental Analysis of Behavior and the Society for the Quantitative Analysis of Behavior, and as an associate editor of the Journal of Experimental Analysis of Behavior. Hackenberg was the president of Division 25 of the American Psychological Association, experimental representative to the ABAI Council, and director of the ABAI Science Board. His major research interests are in the areas of behavioral economics and social behavior. In work funded by the National Science Foundation and the National Institutes of Health, he and his students have developed procedures for cross-species comparisons of behavior. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Tim Hackenberg.
Thanks so much, Ashley, for that very nice introduction. This is a great conference. I always enjoy attending, and I appreciate your coming out on the last afternoon of the conference. I know it's been a long week. You must be very tired. And this is a surprisingly good turnout, especially given the other sessions that are happening at the same time. So I appreciate that. Now that I've been introduced, I can take off my name tag. I won't be confused with anyone else walking around here in the room talking. As Ashley mentioned, I teach at a small liberal arts college, and it's a tiny school, 1,500 students in the student body, and we don't have a lot of big lectures. And so what I do mainly is I facilitate discussions. My students, they love to talk. I can't shut them up. Not that I don't want to, most of the time, but I view my job as an instructor as one of stimulating conversation. And that's what I hope to do today. You may have inferred from the introduction that I'm not a practitioner. I'm not an applied researcher. I'm an experimentalist. So I view this topic from that point of view. And while I know a thing or two about how token reinforcement works in the laboratory, I still have a lot to learn about how token procedures are implemented in applied settings and some of the special challenges that presents. And so what I'm really hoping to do today is to have a conversation. I really want to open it up, have an interactive session, and promote a kind of dialogue between those of us that, like me, who work in the basic animal lab, and those of you who do applied research and practice. So I'm saying this. I know it's the last day of the meeting. You're tired, but I'm going to call on you to help make this session a success. And the success will depend in large part on how much participation we can generate. So please feel free throughout the presentation to ask questions, to make comments. I'm very comfortable in this interruption mode, and I really hope that we can have a productive, stimulating conversation. Okay? Okay, so this topic of token reinforcement is it's one of the oldest and most commonly used procedures in all of applied behavior analysis. But it's a bit of an oddity as far as behavioral technologies go. And what I mean by that is that that there has been very little substantive contact, unlike most successful technologies in behavior analysis. There's been very little substantive contact between basic research and applied work on this topic. Despite basic experimental work that goes all the way back to the 1930s, which we'll be talking about in a bit, and still little is known about how this body of knowledge relates to applications, to applied token economies. And despite over 50 years of applied work in token economies, we still know surprisingly little about the basic processes that are responsible for its effectiveness. Okay, we still have very little limited understanding of its basic principles of operation. And so with a few rare exceptions, the basic research and applied work has developed largely in parallel, with very little integration, with very little cross-fertilization of ideas and concepts. And so part of what I want to do today is to bring together what's known about token reinforcement from the laboratory with token reinforcement in applied contexts. So we'll be summarizing some of the basic and applied research. This is a huge area, so really I'm only going to be able to touch on certain research areas to illustrate some broader points. We'll identify some gaps in the literature, identify some priorities for research, and make some applied recommendations. But again, I approach this topic of making applied recommendations with humility because, as I said, I approach this through the lens of an experimental analysis. One of the things that we have learned from an experimental analysis of token reinforcement in the laboratory with animals is that there seems to be broad-based generalities and basic principles of token reinforcement that cut across species, that cut across different settings, that cut across different responses and reinforcers. So this gives us some confidence that we're dealing with general fundamental principles. And it gives us confidence moving forward in developing an overarching conceptual framework that can make sense of token reinforcement, whether it's in the laboratory or whether it's in an applied setting. So what I'd like to do is first talk a little bit about the history of the field, both in the applied and the experimental realms. And then I'll talk a little bit about how I got interested in token reinforcement, and then we'll develop a functional taxonomy for kind of an analytic framework for making sense of the literature. So tokens, token reinforcement is deeply enmeshed in human culture. Tokens have been with us in one form or another since antiquity, and going back to bartering systems and extending all the way through to the present day. So any type of economic transaction, from the supermarket to the stock market, involves some type of token reinforcement. Okay? You're exchanging something that you've earned in order to gain access to other reinforcers. The origins of what might be called using token reinforcement for educational and as an educational motivational tool can be traced to some pioneering work done by Ione and Azrin. And this was first published in 1965. Origin stories are always difficult. There was maybe a few token studies that appeared, applied token studies that appeared before Ione and Azrin's pioneering work. But in my mind, this is where it all began. This was the first systematic approach to using tokens to, in an applied setting, to improve the quality of people's lives. And this is where the token system was first implemented at Anna State Hospital in Illinois. Am I getting a little feedback there? Okay. This was a psychiatric institution. And what Ione and Azrin did, this was back in the dark days where there was not much that was going on in terms of rehabilitation in these psychiatric wards. But what Ione and Azrin did was they worked with adults diagnosed with various forms of psychoses, and they made tokens contingent on self-help skills, on vocational skills. Tokens were small little metal coins that were earned. They were contingent upon productive behavior. And this was a very big and comprehensive program. The tokens could be exchanged at various times during the day for preferred activities, cigarettes, snacks, and so on. This is a figure summarizing summarizing data from one part of the program. This was during the day. The patients had opportunities to work in a vocational setting. Working produced, I think it was 70 tokens, which they could then exchange for their various reinforcers. They had a choice whether to go to work or not. And this is a really nice demonstration of the power of the token reinforcement program. This shows the number of hours per day that were worked when tokens were contingent upon showing up for work. This is during this phase here, they gave the tokens freely. So the patients learned very quickly that they could get the same goods without showing up for work. Guess what they did? They stopped showing up for work, and then the behavior was reestablished when they returned to the reinforcement contingency. So this shows very clearly in a ABA reversal design that the tokens had functional control. This is just part of the program. They also had token reinforcement procedures in place for self-help skills and so on around the ward. This study, the whole program, was really very, it was in the spirit of an experimental analysis. They were interested in functional control, demonstrating functional control, isolating the relevant variables, and so on. But the applied setting and the behavior that was involved made the applied significance clearly apparent. So even though they were really approaching this as an experimental project, the applied significance was not lost. And so this study helped to launch the applied use of token economies. And within a few years, actually, this is a book-length treatment of the Ione and Azrin token economy program that was published in 1968. It includes some data, but a lot of practical guidance on how to set up, how to establish, how to implement token economies in other settings. And so this study, the one that I talked about at 65, and in particular this book in 68, really helped to launch the applied use of token economies. And within a few years, token systems have been set up in clinics, in classrooms, and in prisons, and other psychiatric institutions, and it really took off. So this is a part of the history of token economies that is familiar to many people. What may be less familiar is another line of research on token systems that goes back even further, back to the 1930s, to some seminal work by Wolf and Cowles. It was done at Yerkes Primate Center and with chimpanzees. And they used poker chip tokens, and the tokens could be exchanged for preferred activities like food and water and social interaction, to name just a few. Okay, so similar to the Ione and Azrin setup, the chimps in this case would work to earn tokens, which they could then later exchange for preferred activities. These were, I should say that this is not one study. Wolf published one, Cowles published the other. These were, I think they were their dissertations, both published in 1936, and they're extensive monographs, about 75 pages each. And I just want to pause and appreciate how rigorous and how forward-thinking some of this work was. Because if you think about what was happening in the 1930s, there was very little in the way of a science of behavior at that time. Skinner had just recently received his PhD. This was 2 years before The Behavior of Organisms was published, and the experimental analysis of behavior was effectively launched. And so to be doing this kind of systematic work on conditioned reinforcement was really ahead of its time. So if you're interested in this kind of thing, I encourage you to go back to the original studies. They're really brilliant for the analysis of conditioned reinforcement. Since that time, the token reinforcement procedures have been extended to other species and other methods. The field, the experimental field of token reinforcement, is one of kind of fits and starts. We had this great work that happened in the 1930s. It lay dormant for a couple of decades, and in the 1950s, Roger Kelleher, who was a great behaviorist and student of Skinner's, took up token reinforcement also with chimps and also in that same facility, in the Yerkes facility, but combined it with this emerging science of schedules of reinforcement, and did some really nice work in the 1950s. In the 1970s, the token reinforcement was extended to rats with marble tokens by Ed Malagodi at the University of Florida. And then in the 90s, my students and I picked up some of this thread, and we applied it to pigeons and to people. Our initial interest in token reinforcement systems was not in token reinforcement per se, but rather as a tool for bridging the gap between procedures that are typically used with humans and procedures that are typically used with animals under laboratory conditions, particularly in the area of choice and self-control. There were a number of papers that were published in the mid-1980s to the early 1990s purporting to show clear human, non-human differences in self-control. So by self-control, I mean a kind of choice between sooner, smaller reinforcers and larger, later reinforcers. So what these choices do is they pit two fundamental reinforcement dimensions against each other: reinforcer immediacy or reinforcer amount. Okay, so so an animal might be given a choice between 2 food pellets now, or 6 pellets after, say, a 6-second delay. Okay, so what does it do? Does it go for the sooner, smaller, or for the larger, later? Well, all kinds of research has shown that pigeons in these kind of circumstances, this typifies the self-control choice, pigeons in these kind of circumstances, what do? They invariably choose the sooner, smaller reinforcer. They do. And what this research in the 1980s was showing is that humans, by contrast, tend to choose the larger, later reinforcer. They tend, in the language of self-control and impulsivity, humans show self-control, pigeons are impulsive. Okay? Now, survey your own behavior and see if do you always show self-control? I'm sure you can find plenty of cases in your own behavior where you behave like a pigeon. And so we looked at this. I was teaching a class at the time in the early 1990s at the University of Florida called The Nature of Human Nature. And what we did was we looked at human, non-human differences reported in the literature on various topics. And when we got to the week on choice and self-control, we analyzed the procedures, and what we realized is that pigeons and humans are studied under very different conditions, at least in these published reports. Pigeons and all non-humans for that matter, tend to produce directly primary or unconditioned reinforcers, food. Okay? So the reinforcers that the pigeons are choosing between, the sooner, smaller, and larger, later, they're primary reinforcers. By contrast, the humans were choosing between secondary or conditioned reinforcers, usually points that were later exchangeable for money. Okay? And we looked at this and we wondered whether this is really a fair test. And so we set out to try to develop procedures that would level the playing field. And so what we realized is that the human situation is really like a token reinforcement system, right? They're making a choice here. They produce a conditioned reinforcer, a point, or a number of points, tokens, that then can be cashed in later for money. Okay? What if we converted the pigeon arrangement also to a token reinforcement system? What if we gave pigeons an opportunity to produce not food directly, but tokens that could then later be exchanged for food? And this was the topic of a dissertation by Kevin Jackson, who actually was Ed Malagodi, who I mentioned a minute ago, had done the pioneering work, some pioneering work with rats on token reinforcement systems. Kevin was Ed's student, and he ended up working on this project with me for his dissertation. And what we showed here was that if you modify the procedures and make them more equivalent, then what you get is actually pigeon performance that more closely resembles that seen in humans. And so the apparent species difference was actually a result of a procedural discrepancy. And so this then launched us onto a line of research that we did with both pigeons and with people on this token reinforcement system. And we extended this in later studies to not just self-control-based choices, but also to risky choices, choices between certain and uncertain reinforcers, and choices between sequences of reinforcers. And what we found in every case was that making the procedures more equivalent would produce, bringing them into greater alignment, would produce performances that were also more closely aligned. Just to drive this point home, this is a figure from a paper with one of my students, Carlo Ligorio, and this was a risky choice procedure, a choice between a certain delay to reinforcement and a variable delay to reinforcement. And we fit the data to a hyperbolic delay model, which I won't be talking about. But I just want to call your attention to this is the obtained performance plotted against that predicted by the model. And you can see that the pigeon and the human data fall along this diagonal. Don't pay attention too much to the different places along this function, because the pigeons and human delays were slightly different, and that's why the pigeon data are out here and the human data are out here. Pay attention just to the fact that they all fall along this line. So we were pretty convinced by this time that at least some of these reported differences in the literature were a product of procedural differences. And when they're made more similar, the species differences are reduced or eliminated. Now, let me just hasten to add that just because we identify some commonalities in the behavior of humans and non-humans doesn't mean that all of the ground is shared. It doesn't mean that people are just like pigeons or just like rats or just like monkeys. There are, of course, important differences. And part of our job is to identify and study the sources of those differences when we find them. But I also want to emphasize the generalities that we see across different species. And this gives us, as I said before, this gives us confidence in proceeding in this analytic way, in a way that is broad enough to capture the behavior of animals and including the humankind. So that was our initial interest in token reinforcement. We use token reinforcement here basically as a tool, as a methodological tool for solving a problem. But at the same time, we became kind of interested in some of the general properties of token reinforcement procedures. And one of the findings from our earliest study on token reinforcement, the study with Kevin Jackson, was this. This shows the choice latency, the time between the beginning of a trial and when the choice is made. Across trials, the exchange occurs out here. Okay, so what the pigeons had to do was make a series of choices, either small or large, and then once they got out here to the end, they could exchange all the tokens they had earned for food. Okay. Each token is worth a certain amount of food, so the more tokens, the more food. But we were puzzled by this. Why do we get these long latencies in the very first trial and then very short latencies thereafter? Well, I had a colleague at the time, the one I mentioned earlier, Ed Malagotti, who did the great work with the rats. And Ed was not only one of the most brilliant minds I've ever encountered in the field of behavior analysis, he also knew he knew more than anyone living at the time about token reinforcement. And so when I showed him these data, this is what he said. It's an exchange schedule, stupid. He's like, looks at this, and believe me, this is something that Ed would say. Even he loved me, but he would say this. It's an exchange schedule. Of course it's an exchange schedule. I think there was a supplementary source of strength at the time. There was, those of you, some of you may remember in the early 90s, part of Bill Clinton's campaign slogan was, what was it? It's the economy, stupid, right? So this was in the early 90s, and Ed modified this to, it's the exchange schedule, stupid. So we looked at this, and so parallel to the line of research on cross-species comparisons, we started to become interested in the properties of token reinforcement in general. Okay, so we had one line of research on the choice and species comparisons, and then we had this other line that we started on token reinforcement per se. This is the way it looks. Okay, so I'm going to show you a video of a pigeon in front of a touch screen and responding on a token reinforcement schedule. So let me just tell you a little bit about what to look for. There are two rectangles on the screen. One pecking, and pigeons can be trained to do this. They peck a touch screen. Pecking one square would produce tokens. This is called a token production schedule, and we'll talk more about this in a little bit. And the tokens are green squares that are aligned horizontally on the left part of the screen. Okay, so each peck on the token production key will produce a token, and they just accumulate. Okay, in this particular procedure, it was a choice procedure, so the pigeon, once the first token was on, the pigeon could choose whether to produce and accumulate additional tokens or to go to the exchange period. The only catch was the exchange period required a lot more effort. I think it was, in this case, 100 responses, okay? So the pigeon's choice is, do I produce more tokens, or do I make the more effortful response of 100 responses in order to produce the exchange period, opportunities to exchange each one of those tokens for, I think it's in this case, 3 seconds worth of food. Okay, so you'll see the pigeon pecking the token production key first, accumulating tokens, and then at some point going over and reluctantly, after a while, pecking the exchange production key, producing the exchange, and then during the exchange, the tokens flash. A single peck on each flashing token produces the food. And in the video, all the lights go off in the chamber. So when it goes dark, that's when the pigeon's got its head down in the food hopper and it's eaten away. Okay? So this is the token production key. These are the tokens accumulating over here. This is the more effortful exchange production key. See, it's not wanting to start that big exchange. It's pausing. It's doing all kinds of other behavior. But eventually, it starts packing this exchange production key. And it's interesting. It's what we see on fixed ratio schedules. Lots of pauses at the very beginning. And then once it gets going, then it's a pretty steady rate of responding up until the exchange period. I have the sound off, but we have this set up so that there's an auditory feedback that's associated with each peck. So there he goes, eating. Now, the exchange is set up in such a way that a peck on any one of those tokens would produce food. Yet, what the pigeon does is it starts at the bottom, moves its way up, right? Why would it do that? Sorry, what? Response effort? It's closer to the food, yeah. So it's going to start with these that are closer to food and then work its way up. That's exactly what happens. Questions about this? Okay. So our conceptualization goes like this. Response produces a token. Okay, so these are token production responses. Produces a token. And then at some point, the tokens then get cashed in for food. And the way that we typically do it is that each token is worth a certain amount of food. Okay, so like, 5 cents is, worth 5 cents. Token here is worth 3 seconds of food. So just to sort of develop, am I out of the frame here? Do I need to stay over here? Okay. Just to develop the terminology, we'll call this the terminal reinforcer. With animals, this is almost always food. Okay, so we can call it a primary or unconditioned reinforcer. But with people, it's not always an unconditioned or primary reinforcer. Okay, so I want to adopt a more generic language, call this the terminal reinforcer. This is the thing that they're working for. Okay. This is the token reinforcer. This is the terminal reinforcer. So if we same basic conceptualization, same basic terminology, but here the kid's producing, let's say, a star. It's contingent on some behavior, and that then can later be exchanged for a terminal reinforcer. But as I just said, These are not always edibles. They're not always primary or unconditioned reinforcers. They might be other things, activities, and so on. But adopting the language of terminal reinforcer is general enough to capture all types of reinforcers. And so too, the tokens and work with humans can come in a variety of forms. So they can be stickers, they can be tangible, manipulable tokens like poker chips, things like that, or they can be visual. They can be checks on a list. It doesn't matter. The important thing is that these are made contingent on some behavior. They accumulate and then can be exchanged for some terminal reinforcer. Okay? So this is basically it. This is the basic conceptualization. Any token reinforcement system has these components. Otherwise, it's not a token reinforcement system. Okay? Behavior produces a token, accumulates, and then is exchanged for something else. So conceptualizing it in this way then allows us to develop an overall framework, a conceptual framework, which I call a functional analysis. And so what we're going to do is explore what is known about token reinforcement in relation to basic behavioral functions. So the basic behavioral functions we'll be talking about today include conditioned reinforcement, motivational variables, generalized reinforcement, discriminative functions, schedule variables, and aversive control. We're going to explore what we know about token reinforcement effects and all of these with respect to these different behavioral functions. Now, we can't do more than just scratch the surface. This is really a vast area. And I'm going to be using the kind of functional taxonomy that I've laid out in a couple of review papers over the past 10 years. One, published in 2009, was a review and analysis mainly of the experimental literature. And then more recently, I've taken the same basic analysis and applied it to, or extended it to, applications and translational research in an attempt to connect what's known about basic and applied work on token systems. So you can check those for more details. We're only going to be able to provide kind of a very general overview today. Okay, so let's start with reinforcement functions. The question here is, do tokens function as conditioned reinforcers? It might seem like an obvious question, right? The common conceptualization is that tokens, by virtue of being repeatedly paired with other reinforcers, acquires conditioned reinforcing functions. That's the common idea. But there's surprisingly little empirical evidence that actually demonstrates that tokens serve as conditioned reinforcers. There is some, and we'll be talking about that, but it's surprisingly scant, the literature on conditioned reinforcing functions of tokens. So let's go back to the wolf experiment that I mentioned briefly earlier. What Wolf did to demonstrate reinforcement functions was he threw some tokens onto the floor of an experimental space. Some of the tokens, the white tokens, could be exchanged for grapes, which turns out chimps really dig. The brass tokens, they did nothing. Okay? And so he was interested in what the chimps would do, which tokens they would pick up and exchange. And of course, with a little bit of experience on this task, chimps are pretty smart. They differentially retrieved and exchanged the food-related tokens, the white tokens, and ignored the others. Okay, so this demonstrates that the tokens had selective reinforcing functions by virtue of being paired with the food, the grapes in this case. It also, of course, shows that that the tokens are serving discriminative functions, right? So the discrimination here is based on the differential reinforcement of what the differential reinforcement of exchanging the different token types. And we'll get to that discriminative functions a bit later. So with humans, there hasn't been that much research, surprisingly, on demonstrating condition reinforcing functions of tokens. But this was an exception, a study by Mower et al. In behavioral interventions about a decade ago. And what they did was they were working with adolescents with intellectual disabilities in a classroom setting. They started out by establishing relations between tokens and high preferred and low preferred reinforcers. So it works something like this. High preferred reinforcers, low preferred reinforcers, and they took some arbitrary stimulus token and paired them with the high preferred and the low preferred to see if the value of those terminal reinforcers would transfer to the token that they were paired with. Here's some illustrative data for one subject. This shows the target response was hand raising, responses per minute. And what this shows is that after the pairing with the arbitrary token, it took on the value of the high preferred reinforcer and maintained high levels of behavior even without the terminal reinforcer. Okay, in the sessions without the terminal reinforcer, it sustained high levels of responding. Okay, so in this case, the tokens had, we might say, a value, response enhancing functions that were very similar to the terminal reinforcer. Okay, so this illustrates an important point that tokens can be just as, in some cases, just as effective as the terminal reinforcers for which they're exchanged.
In the case of the low value token, much less effective than the low value. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes. I'm noticing how ineffective the low value token is in comparison to its backup reinforcer.
Yes. Good point. No, I don't. I think the terminal reinforcer was very low valued, and the token even less so. This one dropped. Yeah.
So presumably it would have continued to drop and maybe flattened out in the same way the token did.
Yes, I think so. I think so. So, I'm sorry, did you have another point to that? Okay. Yeah, I think that's what happened. They were very different in their value, and the tokens reflected that underlying value of the terminal reinforcer. So, what about motivational variables? There's what might we say about tokens? How sensitive are they to the motivational variables, the MOs that are in place for the terminal reinforcers to which they're related? Back to Wolff, back to the 1930s, Wolff did this really interesting experiment where he had two different token types, a black token and a yellow token. The black tokens were exchangeable for peanuts. The yellow tokens were exchangeable for water. Okay? So they learned that if they produced and exchanged the black tokens, they'd get peanuts, earned and exchanged the yellow tokens for water. And then what they did was they manipulated the deprivation. Okay, so under food deprivation, what do you think happened? All black tokens. Actually, it was not exclusive until they increased the deprivation to a sufficient level, and that produced exclusive preference for the black tokens. They completely ignored the yellow ones, and then the reverse happened under water deprivation. They reversed their preference in favor of the water, the yellow tokens associated with the water, showing that the tokens are sensitive to the MOs that are in place for the primary reinforcers. It makes sense, right? If you can just exchange this token type for one particular type of backup reinforcer, then the value of that token is going to rise and fall with the value of the unconditioned or the terminal reinforcer. Back to humans, back to the mower study. And in this phase of the study, they manipulated the motivational conditions. So in some cases, they called satiation. They gave the students pre-session access to the terminal reinforcers. And then in deprivation conditions, they restricted access. And this is for a different student, also hand raising as the response. And what this shows is that these are tokens that were that signaled and could be exchanged for just one type of a backup reinforcer, one type of terminal reinforcer. Under satiation conditions, they got very low responding. And then in the deprivation conditions, where they restricted access to the reinforcer ahead of the session, they got high levels of responding, both for the token and for the terminal reinforcer, which was what? Cheez-Its. Who doesn't like Cheez-Its, right? Cheez-Its and the tokens associated with Cheez-Its, and then it reversed back down to nothing under satiation conditions. So again, showing just like Wolf had with the chimpanzees, that the tokens, the value of the tokens rises and falls with the value of the terminal reinforcers. So this leads then into the question of what if tokens can be exchanged for multiple backup reinforcers? What do we call this? Quiz time. Token economy, sorry?
I was just going to say generalized condition reinforcement.
Yeah, generalized reinforcement. So generalized reinforcers are a special type of conditioned reinforcer that are established as valuable through their relationships to two or more sources of reinforcement. This concept was first developed by Skinner in 1953 in his book Science and Human Behavior. Skinner said the generalized reinforcer is useful because the momentary condition of the organism is not likely to be important. So it's a bit obtuse, but what Skinner was really getting at here is that relevant sources of deprivation are more likely to be in place at the time of reinforcement with generalized reinforcers than with specific reinforcers. So in other words, the generalized reinforcers, because they can be exchanged for multiple backup reinforcers, don't depend for their efficacy on a single type of deprivation. Okay? Therefore, they should hold their value across a much wider range of motivational conditions. And of course, the best example of this in everyday life is currency, it's money. What makes money such a valuable reinforcer? It's because it's highly generalized. It's highly generalized. It can be exchanged for a wide range of backup reinforcers, activities, and so on, events. And so even if you're not hungry or thirsty, money holds its value. Okay, so it's more likely to be effective across a wider range of conditions. So here's how we think about it in token terms. Let's say you have specific tokens, these stars, that during exchange can all be exchanged for one type of backup reinforcer. Let's say, in this case, food, chips, or crisps, as they say in the UK. One type of reinforcer. These are what we call specific tokens because each token can be exchanged for only one type of backup reinforcer. And compare this to the generalized type. Where a token that is earned and accumulates can then be exchanged for a wide variety of backup reinforcers. Sometimes food, sometimes drink, sometimes other activities. And it stands to reason that these types of tokens are going to be more valuable, right? Because even if the kid is not hungry or thirsty, maybe the iPad will be sufficient to give those tokens value. So as a result of this, generalized reinforcers are much less prone to satiation effects because, again, they can be exchanged for such a wide variety of other reinforcers, they're less prone to satiation. They hold their value across a wider range of motivational conditions. This, again, was shown in this Mower study. This study is doing triple duty. This is the last slide I'm going to show from this particular study. It's a really nice study, and one of the few that looked at generalized reinforcement functions in applied settings. That's why I'm making such heavy use of it, because there's very little to go on in the literature. In this particular case, they looked at deprivation. This is the responding for the terminal reinforcer. Then they paired it with one token. Okay, under satiation, it dropped down to very low levels. Under deprivation, it popped back up. Okay, so this basically replicates the effect that we saw earlier, just showing sensitivity to motivational variables. The interesting thing happened here. And here is where they paired the token with multiple terminal reinforcers. So now it can be exchanged for two different things. I forget now what the two things were, but they were two different things. And then they repeated this condition, exactly like this, the satiation condition, where they provided free pre-session access to one of the reinforcers. But guess what? Responding remains strong. Why? Because it could be exchanged for that other reinforcer. Okay? So this illustrates the power of generalized reinforcers. They hold their value across a wider range of conditions. Any questions? Yes?
But they only created satiation. But they only created satiation for one of the reinforcers and left the other in a natural state.
Yes, that's right. That's right. So presumably, if they had given pre-session access to the other, that would have dropped, and then they would have had to pair another one in order to recruit those generalized functions. Yeah. So this is how we have studied this in my own lab with pigeons. So this is similar to the setup that you saw earlier. It's slightly different, but in this case, we've got three different token types. Before you saw just the green tokens over here. In this case, we have three different token types. The green are associated with food, so each one of those tokens can be exchanged for access to food. the red tokens can be exchanged for access to water, and the white tokens are what we call generalized tokens, because these can be exchanged for either food or water. Okay? So what happens when the pigeon produces these is it goes to the exchange, white token is a flashing white token is on, indicating the exchange period. A peck on that key then produces a red and a green key adjacent to that white key that was pecked, and then the pigeon chooses, do I want food now or do I want water? Okay? So do you see why this is generalized? Because it's connected to two different sources of reinforcement. This was published a couple of years ago in JAB in, if you want more details, but I'll just give you the highlights here. The pigeons would choose between two token types at a time. So in some conditions, they would choose between food and water tokens. In some cases, they would choose between food and generalized tokens. In some case, between water and generalized tokens. And these were, the experiment was conducted in a closed economy, so they got all of their food and water, at least in this condition, when they were choosing between food and water, they got all their food and water within the sessions. They had nothing outside the session. Sessions were long. They were like 3 hours, so there was enough time for the pigeons to earn all of their daily food and water during the session. So we were interested in what they would do in these, how they would allocate their choices in this kind of an arrangement. So in the baseline conditions and the food and water conditions, they tended, and this has been, we've seen this in a number of experiments, the pigeons tend to produce about 80% food and about 20% water, something like that. And this is sort of just enough. This is under unconstrained conditions. This is what they do. But the interesting cases were these, where the food was pitted against the generalized and the water was pitted against the generalized. What we did under these conditions was we would selectively deprive the pigeon outside of the session of either food or water. And then we would see whether it would prefer the generalized that was deprived, that they were deprived of. Does that make sense? So let me show you some data. This shows under water deprivation, the darker bars correspond to food. Remember I told you that they'd go for about 80% food and 20% water, something like that? That's what they did. 80% food, 20% water. These were not the water-specific tokens. These were the generalized tokens that they would choose and then exchange for water. All of the generalized that they produced, they exchanged for water. Then we reversed it, and under food deprivation, now this is the water up here, still about 20-25%. These are the generalized tokens. So the light gray bars here under water deprivation, here under food deprivation, remember they tend to produce about 80% of their tokens and exchange them for food. So what they did was they just flipped around, and they understood that the generalized tokens could be exchanged for either water or food, depending on the circumstances. So here they produced the generalized tokens to a high degree and then exchanged them for food. So what they did in all three of these cases was they were able to maintain roughly the same kind of allocation of reinforcers, 80% food, 20% water, but they did so by basically substituting the generalized reinforcers for whichever reinforcer was restricted. They would stand in lieu of food in one case and water in another case. So it's like money, right? You can take money and you can exchange it for food, you can exchange it for drink, and what you exchange it for depends on the relative needs. Yes?
Do you have any thoughts on why they didn't just earn generalized reinforcers for all of them? Why did they bother to choose the reinforcer-specific tokens to earn?
Oh, there's always somebody who asks those questions. Yes, we know why, and I was skipping over this because this is why. Because remember I told you that when they produced generalized, they had to make a further response to choose either the green or the red, the water or the food. And here, in exchange, when they exchanged the specific reinforcer, they only had to make one response. Okay? So pigeons are very, very sensitive to small differences in delay to reinforcement. And so that was enough to, under all things being equal, to prefer the specific over the generalized. But in a thesis by one of my undergraduates at Reed this last semester, we basically replicated this and equalized the response requirements, and that increased the preference for the generalized. Let's see. Sorry. Okay, so that's the bit on generalized reinforcement. Use generalized reinforcers whenever you can. They're going to be much more effective, much more valuable. Yes?
So would the applied recommendations be not to have specific, use specific reinforcers with your token economy system, but to allow the student, once he exchanges, to have access to a range of reinforcers?
Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. So, so the applied recommendation, did you all hear that? Always best to use generalized if you can. You know, perhaps this is not always possible, but if you can, use generalized reinforcers. And I'm glad you brought that up because I think that there, I understand that there's variations of this. Sometimes kids choose the reinforcer before they start the trial, what they're going to work for, okay? And while this is in a sense generalized because they're choosing from maybe a menu of reinforcers, it doesn't take full advantage of, it doesn't completely exploit the benefits of using generalized reinforcers. So it would be better, if possible, to give them the choice at the end. So they are working, then they get to the exchange period, they've got the menu of reinforcers, and then they can choose what they want at that point. It's going to be more, those tokens are going to be more valuable.
Can I add just one question on that point? So for kids who have worked for a lot of tokens, that would also take care of the issue of sort of change in motivation.
Yes.
So if they choose something, then motivation changes.
Right.
They don't have to make that commitment so early on. They can have
Right.
access.
Right.
Okay.
And the buyer's remorse.
Okay.
Yes. Yes, good point. Did you?
And from what you're saying, it would seem that generalized reinforcers will avoid satiation, which is always
Yes.
a problem with tangibles and even activity reinforcers.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. It's a good point. Yes. Oh.
Are you going, I don't know, I'll talk loud. Well, it won't go, it won't pick up. Okay. 3 months. Are you going to? Does this work? Yes. Hello. Are you going to touch on differences between closed and open economies, and also schedules for exchanges?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. It's gonna be a big part of the rest of the talk. So hold on. Yes.
Would you give, sorry, that's really loud. Would you give just like 3 options at the end, or like for them to be able to choose their choice of reinforcement? Or like would you decrease it to like 3 items, or have all the items that they like out and readily available and whatever they choose?
It's a really good question. We know very little about what might be called the generalizability of the reinforcer, how many terminal reinforcers it's connected to. In our cases in the lab, we're really limited to basically 2. We might come up with a third one, drug reinforcer or something like that. But with animals, we're really limited in the range of terminal reinforcers. This is where I think with humans and applied settings, there's a real potential to address these fundamental questions. We don't know. It's a really good question. How many reinforcers are needed to really produce this generalized effect? And so I would say, all else equal, the more the better. But at the same time, it's going to depend on the circumstances. If you have too many reinforcers, it might generate other behavior that's incompatible with what you're trying to maintain. So I think it's going to depend on the particular circumstances. But I would say in general, the more the better. So let's, oh, yes, sorry.
Don't you think sometimes just due to the pragmatics of you go to In-N-Out Burger, you can pick 3 things. You go to Red Robin, you got 75 things to choose from. We need to get back to work, although we still want to the child-to-contact reinforcement. There's a pragmatic aspect to this as well.
Yeah, yes. There's, too many choices can be overwhelming. And it might also be counterproductive if it starts to generate delays and other kinds of behavior that might be incompatible with what you're trying to train. So it's going to reflect a kind of balance between those practical considerations and really trying to take advantage of the generalized function. So again, this is something that's a fundamental unanswered question in the field, and one for which applied research is actually much better suited to address than basic research for the reasons I mentioned earlier. So this is an area where applied research can really be on the leading edge of the science. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about the discriminative functions of tokens. So going back to the original conceptualization, we can think of tokens as part of an extended sequence of behavior. There's the token earning part. There's the accumulation of tokens, how many tokens are needed to get to the exchange, and then there's the exchange for the terminal reinforcer. So we can think about this as a kind of extended chain schedule. And what we know about extended chain schedules is that the stimuli correlated with transitions between the links in the chain serve 2 functions, right? What are they?
Reinforcement and discriminative stimuli.
Right, exactly. Thank you. So we know they serve as reinforcers for the behavior that produces them, and they serve as discriminative stimuli that occasions behavior in the next link of the chain. And if you have an extended chain schedule with lots of tokens that are accumulating before the exchange, the discriminative functions are really important because they're correlated with not only the delay to the terminal reinforcer, but also to the amount of terminal reinforcer, because each token is worth a certain amount of reinforcement. So we can think about, one way to think about the tokens as participating in an extended chain schedule. It's a 3-term contingency. Tokens are earned, they get placed onto a token board, and then eventually exchanged for terminal reinforcement. So as Suzanne just said, the tokens serve multiple functions. So the same event can both reinforce behavior that produced it and signal the upcoming contingency, serve as discriminative stimuli. So how do we use this knowledge and as a guide to how to establish tokens as conditioned reinforcers? There are two basic methods for establishing neutral stimuli like tokens as reinforcers. The kind of standard way of thinking about this is through stimulus pairing. This is Pavlovian conditioning or respondent conditioning. You just take a neutral stimulus and you repeatedly pair it with a terminal reinforcer, an unconditioned reinforcer. And the idea is that through this repeated pairing, the tokens, they take on the value of the terminal reinforcers they're associated with. Yeah? An alternative way to conceptualize this is tokens as participating in a three-term contingency, where the tokens are earned, and you might be wondering what this is. This is the tokens being earned and then placed onto a token board, and then later exchanged for food. So here, the tokens from the very beginning are established both as conditioned reinforcers and as discriminative stimuli. The main difference is that here a response is required to produce the token, whereas here it's response independent. It's just token, food. Here, behavior, token, behavior, food. And I'm not going to go too much into this in the interest of time, but there's some really nice work in the field that directly compares these two methods for establishing tokens as reinforcers. One of my favorite papers is by Per Holth and colleagues using this type of conceptualization to directly compare pairing and what I'm calling three-term contingency or discriminated operant procedures. So there were 8 children with autism in this study. They were interested in training joint attention skills, and they directly compared these two methods. And then once these were established, they asked to what extent will the tokens, excuse me, to what extent will the tokens have been established via these two methods support new behavior when they're made contingent on some new response. It's called the new response method. And what they find is that the discrimination procedure is clearly superior almost across the board. There's only 1 out of 7 cases does the pairing method work as well. But in almost every case, the number of responses and the duration of responses is greater for the discriminated operant procedure. So the recommendation, and this makes a lot of sense, right? That if you establish the tokens from the get-go as part of a chain, they're going to be more effective. It's also more similar to the kinds of procedures that you're going to, or the kinds of context to which you want this to generalize. If you're establishing tokens as reinforcers for a token economy, you're going to, you want behavior to produce the tokens and to have this response contingency from the outset. And so the recommendations are, for this whole general area, would be to restrict access to the terminal reinforcer. Okay, this is the motivational bit. This enhances the value of the tokens. Use generalized reinforcers, as we've said, including both edible and not edible ones. This is going to enhance the value across different motivational conditions. Require an exchange response from the beginning of training. to establish both the reinforcing and the discriminative functions of the tokens. And then to use, once that's established, use backward chaining then to train the rest of the sequence. Okay? Yes?
Do you feel like commenting about whether or not the second procedure, the three-term contingency kind of procedure, has anything to say about the PIE, the phylogenetically important event theory? It was a "do you feel like" question.
No, not really. What this person is asking about is an esoteric theoretical framework that I'm not sure that I completely believe. So, no, I don't want to get off onto that tangent. Thank you for the question, though.
If I can ask something more operational and concrete, if we, require an exchange response. So if we have one of our kiddos, and usually I act like a drug dealer. I always give a kid a little taste to whet their appetite. I'm from Philly. So getting the exchange response, should we ask one of our kids to do a simple task? When they comply, they get the token, and then hand over hand, have them give us the token, and then say, pick, play. To train the response. If we have a severely autistic kid that might not pick up the use of tokens by themselves, and we're waiting waiting for that might take a while. Just prompting it. And
Yes.
Hand over hand.
Yes, I would just, what I'm suggesting is something even simpler, and that is just give the kid the token and just require the exchange. Okay? And then once that's established, that will establish the tokens as a conditioned reinforcer. And then once that's established, then you just work backwards in a backward chaining to then arrange for behavior to produce the token. And then you're off to the races. Okay? So, 1:15 to, I'm trying to decide when to take a break. Let's try to get through another little bit of material, and then we'll take a break in a couple of minutes. Okay with people? Yeah? Okay. So I next want to talk about token reinforcement schedules. So to this point, we've been talking about tokens in a fairly simplified way where each and every response produces a token. I want to now talk about the importance of the schedule on which tokens are produced and exchanged. So there are two basic token schedules that combine to create an overall token reinforcement schedule. The first is what we might call a token production schedule. This is how and when tokens are earned. How many responses are required to produce a token? How long do you have to wait to produce a token? And the second important component is what we call the exchange production schedule. This is, once that token is produced, how many tokens do you have to get to accumulate before you get to the exchange? Okay? How and when tokens, or how much time do you have to wait before those tokens that you've earned can be exchanged? These two schedules together interact in determining the token reinforced performance. So let's go through some examples. Starting with pigeons, responses produce a token. Let's say a single response produces a token. This would be an FR1 token production schedule. Single response produces the token, goes onto the board, and then goes back to the beginning, creating opportunities to earn additional tokens. Let's say the procedure is set up in such a way that 3 tokens are needed before you get to the exchange period. So you have to repeat this chain 3 times, this sequence 3 times, produce the token, produce the second token, produce the third token. We would say, and then this then goes to the exchange period. We would say that this is an FR3 exchange schedule. Same basic arrangement with kids in a classroom. FR1 produces a token. 3 tokens go to the exchange. Okay? So the way we describe this is FR1 token production, FR3 exchange production. 1 response to produce a token, 3 to get to the exchange. Now let's break this down further. Schedule types come in basically 2 flavors. One is a ratio or work-based schedule. So FR3, for example, exchange after 3 tokens, or less commonly used but still critical are interval or time-based schedules. So say the exchange happens after the first token is after 30 seconds. First token is produced after 30 seconds. This would be an FI30 exchange. So what I want to do then is just discuss briefly some of the research, both from the laboratory and from applied settings, that illustrate these schedule interactions, because these are really critical determinants of what you get in a token economy. Let's start with token production schedules. Remember Kelleher, I mentioned as one of the pioneers of token reinforcement in basic research. He did combined this with schedule research, and poker chip tokens could be exchanged for food. The exchange was held constant. I think it was an FR60. So the chimps had to earn 60 tokens before they could get to the exchange period. So a fairly long, fairly effortful exchange schedule. The FR token production schedule was varied systematically across conditions. And what he found was these are cumulative records. And so this is cumulative responses over time. And you may remember from your basic behavior analysis classes that the FR patterning follows this kind of break and run response pattern, this kind of staircase where you get a little bit of pausing before the run. So this is pause after reinforcement. These diagonal blips here are reinforcers. A little pausing after reinforcement, and then an abrupt transition to a high response rate up to the next reinforcer. So these are the response patterns for producing tokens. And then at the end here, after 60 tokens have been produced, then the chimp is living large, can exchange all of those for 60 bits of food. Okay, and so this suggests that the tokens are serving these conditioned reinforcing functions. They're substituting for food. They're generating patterns that are virtually identical to those produced under food. There's other evidence bearing on this, but this shows the importance of the token production schedule as one piece of the token economy. More important, let me say that again to emphasize, more important is the exchange production schedule. And this is what, relative to the token production schedule, this is what's really driving things in a token economy, the exchange production schedule. Why is that? That's right, exactly. What's your name? Randy, thank you. That's exactly right. This is the exchange production schedules when they're encountering reinforcement. So if you think about a token schedule as an extended chain schedule, the exchange production schedule is closer to food. Yes?
A lot of times in the field, I find that if the teacher says
a lot of times I find that in the field, if I have a teacher or somebody saying, oh, token economy isn't working, this isn't working, I find this is the area to first look at to see how much time has passed.
Yes,
So.
absolutely. It's a great point, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a bit. So on the exchange production schedule, there's not a lot of applied research on this, but if you dig a little bit, you can find evidence of exchange schedule effects. There's a classic experiment from the achievement place setting published in the early 1970s. And in this particular study, it was a group home with what were then called delinquent adolescents. I don't know what they're called these days, but they were then called delinquent adolescents. And they had this token system that pretty much encompassed all of all the happenings in the group home. But the one bit I want to talk about is they were interested in increasing the savings that the kids would make into a bank account. So they were interested in trying to increase the deposits that they would make into a savings account. And then they had exchange periods every Friday. So we can think about this as being an FI 7-day exchange. So any tokens that they had earned during the week could be exchanged then. But they were reinforcing deposits into a bank. So they'd get extra tokens if they would take some of their tokens and save them. Okay? And what they found was fascinating. Under baseline, when there was no contingency in place, they didn't save very much. But then, sorry, hit the wrong button.
Is that a red button or a green one?
What they found here was this is where the exchange periods happen. And what they see is this pausing or low exchanging early in the week, and then as Friday approached, they would get an increased level of exchange. Okay, so this follows again, going back to your intro behavior analysis, this is on FI, you get this low period of responding after reinforcement and then a gradual acceleration up to the next reinforcer. Yeah? And that's what this looks like to me, this kind of temporal control by the FI exchange schedule. So let's go back to the lab. This was an analogous type of experiment that was done by Waddell et al., published in 1972, almost the same time as this achievement place. But again, this is one of the odd things about the field. They're talking about this, they're studying the same thing, but there's no crosstalk at all. There's no reference to the applied work in the rat study. There's no reference to the animal work in the applied study. It's remarkable. So in this particular study, there were rats. They were producing marbles that could be exchanged for food. The token production schedule was a FR20. So 20 lever presses produced a marble, and then could be exchanged on an FI exchange, which was systematically manipulated across conditions from 1.5 minutes to 9 minutes. And what they found was very similar to, I forgot to mention, the et al. Here was Malagodi. This was one of Malagodi's students. It's an exchange schedule stupid guy. He had done this great work on exchange schedule effects. So what this shows is that there are FR20s that produce the tokens and then can be exchanged here at the end of the interval. And so within this inner reinforcement interval, you get this FR-like behavior, the break and run. And then if you look at the cycle as a whole, you see this kind of more FI-like, little responding and then a gradual acceleration. So just to drive home the point, these are the data we just saw with the people, with the adolescents. These are the data with the rats. So despite completely different species, different responses, different tokens, different terminal reinforcers, we see basically the same response patterning, which really speaks to the power and the generality of these principles. What? Some people are calling for a break. How does that sound? Okay. Man, I still have a lot to cover. So how about a 10-minute break? Is that okay? Okay, we'll get back started at 3. Okay, why don't we resume? Others will be filtering in for the next few minutes, but we've been talking most recently about, am I on? Can you hear me? Doesn't feel like I'm on.
It's a little quieter than it was.
Can you hear me in the back? Can you hear me? Okay. Well, that's good. We've been talking about the importance of schedule variables in token reinforcement. And to this point, we've talked about the importance of token production schedules, exchange production schedules. We've talked a little bit about difference between fixed ratio and fixed interval schedules. What I want to do next is shift gears a little bit and talk about what might be called the periodicity of reinforcement, how regular it occurs. And this turns out to be a crucial determinant of behavior in token reinforcement schedules. So in a fixed schedule, this means that the requirements for reinforcement remain the same from one reinforcer to the next. Fixed ratio 3, for example. And this is contrasted with variable schedule, where the requirements are unpredictable or uncertain from one reinforcer to the next. So for example, a VR3 would be exchange after 3 tokens on average, but you can't predict what's going to come up on the next, the upcoming cycle. What do you think generates the highest rates of behavior, fixed or variable? Thank you. So this is something that Atlantic City learned a long time ago. Before we were in the lab studying variable ratio schedules, they figured it out. These are the kind of schedules, because of their unpredictable nature, generate high rates of behavior and that are resistant to extinction. And this is what the casinos love, the resistance to extinction part. And it turns out that this has been, did I miss a slide? This has been demonstrated widely in research. Some of my students and I demonstrated this within a token reinforcement context. It's an old study by Foster and colleagues in which pigeons' pecks on a key produced tokens on an FR50. So 50 responses produces 1 token, and then the exchange production schedule was either a fixed ratio schedule or a variable ratio schedule, and the value of the schedule was manipulated across conditions. So sometimes a single token was enough to get to the exchange, sometimes 2 tokens, sometimes 4 tokens, sometimes 8. Now again, it was within a condition, it was always the same. It was always 2, but what would vary would be whether it was fixed or variable, okay? So we were interested to see whether these kinds of different exchange production schedules would generate different rates of behavior, and in fact they did. So these are the data for 3 different pigeons. These are response rates across the exchange ratios. So at 1, a fixed ratio is identical to a variable ratio schedule, right? Because there's not much variability on an FR1. So these are the same. But then across conditions, the work requirements increased. And this is what you get. When you increase the work requirements, you get steadily declining response rates. So if we look at the FR exchange data, these are the open symbols, and we get a steadily declining rate of responding as you increase the amount of work. So remember that each one of these tokens required 50 responses. So here, it's 100 responses before you get to the exchange. Here, it's 200 responses. And here, it's 400 responses before you get to food. Okay, so it's a lot of work we're asking for the pigeons, from the pigeons. But now, what happens if you make those variable? Same average number of responses to produce the exchange period, but it's unpredictable. And what ends up happening is that you get higher rates of responding under the variable exchange. Same exact number of responses on average, but the variable exchange produces elevated rates of behavior.
Years ago, I don't recall what study, they said establish fixed ratio first, and then once the pattern's established, then switch to a variable. Is that valid, or do you go right into a variable schedule, a variable ratio rather? And it's not an esoteric.
No, it's a very straightforward question. I appreciate that. I don't see any reason to go to a fixed ratio first.
Okay.
I mean, it might just be easier on the trainers to do, to sort of, get a hold on it and then change the requirement. I could see that being maybe a practical guideline, but from a theoretical point of view, there's no reason to start with a fixed ratio and then move to a variable.
I think that's what it was, to establish the pattern first so that the organism or the person gets the idea this is what we're doing, and then they would switch it out. But I hear what you're saying. No, go right to the
Yeah, in fact, I'm going to make a recommendation here in a bit that always use variable schedules whenever possible.
Got it.
I know that they're more challenging to implement in some cases, so that may be there may be practical considerations, but it's going to always be best to use variable schedules.
So go right for it. Thank you.
So in addition to generating higher rates of behavior under variable schedules versus fixed schedules, there's a large literature showing strong preference for variable over fixed. So if you give organisms choices between the same average rate of return, but some are available on a fixed schedule and some on a variable schedule, animals, including human animals, strongly prefer the variable. Okay. This was shown in a relatively recent experiment published in JAVA by Latenty et al. And what they were studying fourth graders in a classroom setting, and they gave the kids choices between doing math problems. They chose between a fixed ratio 5 exchange and a variable ratio 5 exchange. So the average number of math problems needed to get to the exchange period was the same. The only difference was whether it was fixed or variable. And what they found, I'm not going to go through all of the data, but basically what they found was that there was a strong preference for the variable over the fixed, even though the overall requirements were similar. And in some cases, they even were able to push up the variable schedule to a 6. So the overall amount of work needed to get to the exchange was actually higher on the variable option, yet they still maintained this preference for the variable over the fixed. So that tells you how strong that is. This was a study that was actually a very close replication of an experiment that we did with pigeons back in, published in 2010. Same basic procedures, and we got the same basic results. Okay, so again, this speaks to the broad generality of these principles across species and settings. So let's get to a few recommendations, which we just talked about, which schedule should be used. Whenever possible, I would recommend using ratio over interval schedules, and that's simply because ratio schedules, all else equal, produce higher rates of responding than interval schedules, assuming what you're trying to get is higher rates of responding, as you usually are when you're implementing a token system. You're trying to increase some behavior. And importantly, whenever possible, use variable schedules over fixed. Again, because of the unpredictable nature of variable schedules, it's going to generate less pausing during the chain. It's going to generate higher rates, all else equal. So another important consideration in applying this knowledge to applied settings is which schedule, the token production schedule or the exchange production schedule, should be changed first. Which should be changed first? Herein, depends. I heard someone over here, exchange. The exchange schedule should be changed first. It does depend on some things, but all else equal. And let's talk about why that is. And this turns out to be really important. It might be counterintuitive. You've got the token production schedule, which is what starts the chain, and then you've got the exchange production schedule. You might think it might not matter much, or maybe we'll start by increasing the token production schedule. And by increasing, I'm talking about once you've established the basic token reinforcement performance, you don't want to be delivering tokens after every single response. It's not very efficient, right? So you eventually want to lean the schedule so that your student is emitting more behavior to produce the token and more tokens to produce the exchange. Which of those variables turns out to be most important? Well, it depends, and this is why your response is exactly right. It depends on the type of token schedule you're using. And there are a couple of different varieties. In what I'm calling a pure token reinforcement schedule, each token is exchanged for a unit of the terminal reinforcer. So in our experiments with pigeons, each one of the tokens is worth, let's say, 3 seconds of food. Okay? Each token that is earned in a classroom setting, each, let's say, sticker, is worth 30 seconds of access to the iPad. Okay? And there's a direct correlation between the number of tokens and the amount of reinforcement. Okay, so in the classroom case, if you earn 2 tokens, now you get 60 seconds of access to the iPad. 3 tokens and 90 seconds access to the iPad, and so on, right? This is the way that token reinforcement schedules are studied in the lab, in what I'm calling pure token reinforcement. Now, I have come to understand that in applied settings, this is not always the way it's done. Sometimes you have token earning opportunities, you accumulate a bunch of tokens, and then you get to the exchange, and you get 1 reinforcer, right? That's okay, but it's not a pure token reinforcement schedule then, because what's lacking is the correlation between the number of tokens you've earned and the amount of reinforcement in the exchange. What we'd call this is an extended chain schedule. You've got stimuli tokens that are earned and accumulate in the space, and so they're correlated with the time, the delay to the exchange, but not with the amount of reinforcement in the exchange. Okay? They're correlated with proximity, but not reinforcer magnitude. So our recommendations about which schedule to change first depend in part on which type of token schedule you're utilizing. So in what I'm calling a pure token reinforcement schedule, what happens when you increase the exchange production schedule? So let's say you've got an FR1 token production. Each response produces a token. And then you've got to get 3 tokens before you get to the exchange. Well, you got a big reinforcer here. Each one of those tokens produces its own reinforcer. So you've got 3 units of reinforcement in the exchange. Now, that is if you increase the exchange production schedule first. What if you increase the token production schedule first such that you require 3 responses to produce a token, and then only 1 response to produce the exchange? Notice that the overall number of responses to get to the exchange is the same. It's 3 in each case, right? But the difference is in the number of tokens you have when you get to the exchange. In this case, you've got 3 exchangeable for 3 units of terminal reinforcement. Here you have 1 exchangeable for 1. And so this is why in a pure token reinforcement schedule, it's best to increase the exchange production schedule first, keeping the token production requirements as low as possible. This is going to be best. This is going to be the way to generate the highest rate of behavior. Keep the token production schedules low and increase the exchange production schedules. If you're using an extended chain schedule where there's only 1 reinforcer at the end in the exchange, the recommendation is still the same, but it's not quite as strong. So here, you've got FR1 to produce the token, FR3 to get to the exchange, and a single unit of reinforcement. If you increase the token production schedule first, still 3 responses to get to the exchange, you'll also just have 1 reinforcer at the end, okay? So what you've eliminated here is the reinforcer magnitude difference that you have in the token reinforcement schedule. So under these conditions, we're only getting 1 reinforcer at the end, which would be better to exchange or to alter first? Still the exchange, but why?
Because each token still functions as a conditioned reinforcer. So each response still gets reinforced. Whereas if you change the production, he's essentially having to work for producing more responses,
Yes.
but still just 1.
Great answer. Did you all hear that? So basically, yes, you're getting the same number of responses, same amount of reinforcement, but in this case, you've got 3 conditioned reinforcers. Here you've got 1. Okay, so just based on the difference in the number of tokens, one would still recommend changing the exchange production schedule first. Okay? So our recommendation then is even when both arrange similar overall requirements, the exchange schedule does it at a lower price, lower number of responses per reinforcer when you're using a token schedule, and it does it with additional tokens when you're using an extended chain schedule. So the recommendation then is to increase, whenever possible, increase the exchange schedule before you increase the token production schedule. Yes?
I have a practical question, which is a lot of us, when we're working with token economies, we use token boards, and which have a fixed amount of spaces. So if we wanted to, let's say we wanted to use the same kind of setup, but change the exchange schedule, even when we're using different types of token boards, like one time is 5, one time is 7, one time is a 6-space token board, these are not variable exchanges, they're still fixed, even though, so is that right? Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's
okay.
right.
So even though we're saying we're varying the exchange,
There's still a
clear
still discriminable.
signal. Okay. So that was my first question. So how do we do it given that setup? How do we make it variable in practice?
That's a really good question.
Something that we've tried is we have a certain number of tokens on the board already, so that they're always trading it in when they get to like a certain amount, but they just start off with some of those already in place. Yeah.
But still, there's going to be, on each trial, there's going to be a fixed number of slots that they have to get to, right? So
So I have,
some are filled out, but the ones that are remaining provide a signal that you have this many to go. And what you want is that for that to be unpredictable when you're going to get to the exchange. Did you have another suggestion?
so one thing we've done is to give the board with quite a lot of spaces, and we just give a token that's a different color at the end. So that signals the exchange. So it may be a 100 space token board. So production FR1, respond token, green token, but when we want now to fulfill the exchange criterion, we just give a different color, which we trained originally when we trained the token. So that always signals exchange. So we can still use our token board because we like it and it's really useful in the classroom, but it's a different color.
That's brilliant. I
token.
wish I'd thought of that. Yes.
Just a minute.
Oh, well, I was just thinking as far as the boards, I mean, they are useful for practitioners, but they don't need boxes. Like, I don't think that a child would not respond to the token reinforcement if there were no boxes. So if you just had an empty board with no spaces to fill, they wouldn't know how many they had to get. It would get rid of that predictability of like, oh, I see 4 more boxes, I have to get 4 more. It's just sometimes you end on 4, sometimes you end on 3.
Yeah,
But you don't need the boxes to make it work.
True. I mean, that's really the essential part, the unpredictability of it. Yeah.
We use boxes in our classroom, and we'll have a board that has like 10 or 12 boxes on it, and all of ours are laminated. So if we're only going to have them work for a certain number of tokens, then we like use a dry erase marker and like X out the boxes that we're not going to use. So then they know, okay, I get up to this point, then that's when I get my reward. Because if you have a kid who's not knowing when they're going to get their reward, then like especially with autism and their rigidity, then that's going to cause anxiety as well. So we love our dry erase markers.
But that's a fixed schedule. So, yeah, I mean, I'm not saying never use a fixed schedule, but whenever possible, it's going to be more productive to use a variable schedule.
Sorry, I'm struggling with the understanding of why that's fixed, because of like a variable ratio schedule is a sequence of individual fixed ratios. So if you're varying the ratio from one session to the other, doesn't that make it a variable ratio?
My understanding was there's a fixed number of slots on a board that provides a signal that you have this number of tokens that you have to earn before you get to the exchange. And that's what makes it a fixed schedule. Even though from one trial to the next, that might vary. The number of tokens that you have to earn might vary, but on a given trial, if there's a signal telling you how many you have to earn.
Right, so is there research that investigates that the importance of not knowing on variable? There is good research on that.
Well, the stuff that I have talked about, but not in this particular context, not in a classroom context. I'm making these extrapolations based on the research, but this is an open question.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Has anyone ever
Wait, get the mic.
Has anyone ever thought of the most obvious place to do a human study, a casino, where the tokens are the tokens are money, and there's a lot of variability in the reward schedules and stuff.
Yes, I think this has direct relevance to gambling, and people have looked at gambling through this variable ratio lens, and have interpreted the high rates of gambling in those terms. So yes, absolutely. Okay, we're going to switch gears now and talk about aversive functions of tokens. Given the evidence that tokens serve as conditioned reinforcers, then the question is, does their contingent loss punish behavior? Okay? Does taking a token away, dependent on some behavior, suppress or decrease behavior? There's a classic study, something special about the early 70s when it comes to these seminal papers. Another early 70s paper published in JAVA by Burkhardt and Barrera compared token loss to timeout from reinforcement. These are both what we would generally consider to be negative punishment procedures. They're designed to decrease behavior by taking something away, a token or access to reinforcement in the case of timeout. So they studied adolescents with intellectual deficits. Tokens were earned in a workshop setting for tasks, and what they called antisocial behavior was punished. So this is just problem behavior was punished in one of two ways, either by removing the child, the adolescent, from the situation, timeout, or by removing tokens. And they also compared different magnitudes of loss or timeout. So 5 tokens versus 30 tokens, 5 minutes of timeout versus 30 minutes. 30 minutes of timeout. Holy cow.
30 minutes from being able to earn another token?
Yeah. That was 30 minutes of time out. Yes, 30 minutes from the opportunity to earn another token. So the basic findings were that both procedures, the timeout and the token loss procedure, produced decrements in responding, and they were magnitude related, such that the bigger magnitude, either the 30 token loss or the 30-minute timeout, produced bigger effects than the smaller magnitude punisher. And this corresponds to basic research with other types of aversive stimuli like electric shock. More intense shock suppresses behavior more strongly than less intense shock. So we have really this connects to a general principle of punishment. But interestingly, the differences, there were very few differences in the timeout versus the token loss. They were equally effective punishers in this particular study. As I said, these are both considered negative punishment procedures. You're taking something away in order to decrease behavior. One question that arises, especially for experimental geeks like me, when with negative punishment procedures of any sort, is that when you're removing reinforcers, you're also reducing the rate of reinforcement, right? So it introduces another potential variable, another potential reason why you get a decrease in responding. So if you're removing a kid from a situation during a timeout, or you're taking tokens away, you are at the same time reducing the amount of positive reinforcement, right? And so you've got this decline in responding. Is it due to punishment, or is it due to the decreased rate of reinforcement that is concomitant with these punishment procedures? Okay, so this is a question about the controlling variables. This turns out to be very difficult to disentangle in most applied settings, but we can do it in a lab. That's what we did. So this is a study by some students and myself, published about a decade ago. And what we did was we had pigeons responding on multiple schedules. Remember from your intro classes, multiple schedule is where two schedules are in effect and they alternate. And they're each associated with a distinctive cue or their own discriminative stimuli. So you've got one schedule in place for a while. In the presence of one stimulus, that switches to a different schedule in the presence of a different stimulus. In one component of the multiple schedule, it was gain only. So it was all good. Pigeons were responding on a VI, a variable interval, 30-second schedule of token production. So on average, every 30 seconds, a token would be produced. And they could be exchanged on a VR4 schedule, variable ratio 4. So on average, when 4 tokens had been produced, they could get to the exchange. But this varied unpredictably. So sometimes it was 1, sometimes it was 8, sometimes it was 4. But on average, it was a VR4 in the gain condition. So all was good in the gain condition. But then in the loss condition, they would also lose tokens on an FR2 schedule. So the gain contingencies were the same in both components. Okay? The contingencies for producing the tokens and exchanging them were VI30, VR4. So every 2 minutes, on average, they could get to the exchange in both components, and they could exchange usually 4 tokens. But in the loss component, every second response dropped a token off the board. Okay, so it's a fairly stringent punishment schedule. Every second response produces a token loss. And so what we were interested in was whether we would get differential behavior in those two components, higher in the gain only, lower in the punishment component. But to control for the decreased rate of reinforcement that accompanied the token loss schedule, we introduced a yoked control where we just simply took the rate of reinforcement from the punishment component and we gave that to the pigeon freely in a different condition. Okay? Do you see the logic? Do you see the logic? If in that condition, the rate of reinforcement was the same as in the punishment condition. So we're looking for any differences. If the decreases are just driven by the decreased rate of reinforcement, then we would expect the rates of behavior to be the same in those two components, right? If the punishment contingency adds some additional oomph to it, if it adds some additional effect, then we would expect in those conditions the responding to be even lower than in the yoked food conditions. Does that make sense? Okay. So here's what we found. The hatched bars here, these are data for 4 different pigeons. This is the proportion of the responding in the no loss component. These are the baseline when there's no loss. So you just get higher rates here. This is the punishment component with the gain and the loss. So decreased rates here relative to the baseline with the no loss. Then we come back to baseline, it pops back up. This is the yoked food where we just took the obtained rate of reinforcement from the punishment component and we just played it back. We just gave it freely under these conditions. So the rate of reinforcement is the same here and here. The only difference is the punishment contingency here. So you can see that the rates here are lower than they are here, that demonstrates a punishment effect, apart from the decreased rate of reinforcement that obtains in those punishment components. So you can think about this as being the difference between the rates here in the yolk food and the baseline, when there's no loss, represent the differences that we can attribute to the loss of reinforcement, the decreased rate of reinforcement. And then the difference between this and this reflect the effects of punishment. Okay? So this helps us to understand that punishment in these kind of negative punishment preparations, token loss, and the same, actually, we've done similar things with timeout, that these effects can be attributed to punishment, to the contingent removal of the tokens or the contingent timeout, apart from the decreases in the rate of reinforcement. So we know it's a true punishment effect. Going back to the applied setting, here's a paper by Donaldson and colleagues that compared token gain and token loss. So this is a slightly different issue. Other things being equal, does gain or loss produce the better clinical outcomes? So they were studying typically developing first grade kids in a classroom setting. They gave tokens for on-task behavior, and they removed tokens for disruptive behavior. So it worked like this. Under the gain conditions, they would just get tokens that they could then exchange for goodies. Under the loss conditions, they would lose tokens. So they would start the classroom session with a bunch of tokens, and then when they misbehaved, they would lose them. Okay? And then, interestingly, once they implemented these two procedures, one after the next, then they gave the kids a choice. Would you rather work under the gain conditions, or would you rather work under the loss conditions? They gave them a choice. And what they found basically was, this is the responses, this is the disruptive behavior per minute. So in baseline, they had some disruptive behavior. It was wiped out in the token conditions. These are the gain only, the triangles are the gain only, the squares are the loss, and there's really no difference. I mean, it's pretty much a floor effect. They both produced really effective outcomes. Not much of a difference. They popped back up during baseline when the contingencies were removed, and then they gave the kids a choice, and there was maybe a small preference for the loss. More of the kids ended up choosing the loss conditions over the gain conditions, but it was a very small effect. So the take home here is that, other things being equal, gain and loss seem to produce about the same outcomes, and this has been shown in other research as well. And there's some evidence beyond this that that token loss might be slightly preferred over gain. I'm not really sure why that is, but it is a finding. Yes?
I think that one potential reason it might be depends on the schedule by which you deliver the tokens for earning. Like if it's like a DRO, just absence of problem behavior, you get it at the end of the interval, versus response cost. If it happens immediately upon the instance of behavior, then you can maximize reinforcement by learning the appropriate behavior faster.
It's a good point, and there's a certain asymmetry in this comparison. You have tokens that are lost for one response class, problem behavior, and you've got tokens that are earned for a different response class, adaptive behavior, or whatever the target behavior is. So it's really difficult to do these kinds of comparisons, but that's a really good point. Next question about token loss is, does it matter whether the tokens that are taken away are first earned or whether they're given freely, as in the Donaldson et al. Experiment? does it matter whether they're earned first, whether they're produced and then taken away? Did one fall away? Okay, good. That's what it's supposed to do. Does it matter whether they're earned or provided freely? Turns out, yes, it matters. What do you think? Yeah, it's earned. I mean, this kind of has a certain intuitive plausibility. It's also borne out by some, not a lot of research, but some research. And it turns out that, I'm not going to talk about any of this research, but I'm just going to summarize the take-home message. Tokens that are earned are more valuable than tokens that are given freely, and they're more aversive to lose than those that are provided freely. And it's token loss procedures are associated with very few negative side effects, but in the few cases in the literature that I've been able to find that have produced some negative side effects, they have always been those cases where the tokens have been earned and then taken away. And that seems to maybe be more likely to generate some unwanted side effects. Okay, now we get to some complicated variables that are unique to punishment. Punishment's a lot more complicated than reinforcement because punishment presupposes you've got some reinforcement schedule in place, and then you've got to have some punishment schedule that's overlaid on the top of that. And the punishment schedule interacts with the underlying reinforcement schedule. So in coming up with some recommendations, we have to take into account all of these different ways that the gain and the loss schedules interact with one another. So what kind of loss schedules to use? Well, it's going back to old research on punishment in the lab, and it's generally best to try, to maximize the effectiveness of punishment, it's generally best to punish as many responses as possible. So you want to have a high ratio of punished to unpunished behavior. So the recommendation would be, like we did in the experiment with humans, use a very dense reinforcement schedule. This is going to produce the biggest punishment effects, the biggest suppression of behavior. But what's the problem? Big punishers mean low reinforcement rates, and that may weaken behavior that you're trying to sustain. And so it becomes very complicated. One very clear and obvious recommendation is to always, whenever possible, provide an unpunished alternative. This is going to maximize the effects of punishment by providing an alternative, non-punished response, one that produces the same positive reinforcers, but without punishment. So I have too many schematics here. Provide an alternative response that produces its own reinforcers. What I want to talk about next then is what kind of gain schedules to use when you're using a token loss procedure. What about the underlying schedule of positive reinforcement? Does this matter? Yes, it matters. What type of gain schedules to use? This is going to depend on a balance of different variables. So let's say you use a ratio exchange. What this means is that you're steadily accumulating tokens, leading up to the exchange. And then if you introduce punishment on top of that, basically what you're doing is you're taking token away and you're pushing behavior back, right? You're pushing it back closer to the beginning of the chain. And in the most extreme case, if you took all the tokens away, you would go all the way back to the beginning of the chain. So it's sort of like, it's like Sisyphus. You're pushing the boulder up the hill, and then you get a punishment, you go all the way back down, and then you got to push it back up. So if your punishment schedule is too severe, then you're going to increase the distance to reinforcement, and that's going to weaken the behavior you're trying to strengthen, right? So this is something that has to be taken into account. You've got to balance these different priorities. So what happens if you use an interval exchange? So remember, on an interval exchange, all that's needed is not the number of tokens, but just simply producing one token after some period of time has elapsed. Okay? So here, token losses don't necessarily affect the exchange delay. They'll affect the amount of reinforcement you get during the exchange, but they won't affect necessarily the delay to the exchange. So this might be advisable in those situations when you're worried about decreasing the rate of reinforcement too severely. So the recommendation is to use dense or high rate loss schedules whenever possible. If you're using token loss to decrease problem behavior, you want to use schedules that are going to be most efficacious, and that's going to be dense, high rate loss schedules. Provide alternative, non-punished alternatives. Provide alternative, unpunished alternative. I don't know what I was thinking. Use interval-based exchange schedules if the reinforcement rate is a concern. If you're worried about the weakening effects of reduced reinforcement rate, you might want to consider using an interval-based exchange schedule. And finally, to use response-dependent gain and loss schedules, okay? Because the tokens are going to be more valuable if they're response-dependent, and their loss is going to be more aversive. It's going to be more painful if they have been earned rather than given freely. Yes? It's a chain.
I'm sure if you're like a BCBA, you're just like punishment, punishment, punishment. We just have special considerations for punishment. I appreciate you going on about, how to do like the loss schedule and whatnot, but I think as behavior analysts, like we have an obligation to make sure that we are using reinforcement as much as possible, like you're saying, and in special circumstances, making sure we have data to back up any use of punishment. So I just was pulling out like the ethical part of this, so.
Okay, I appreciate that. So are you saying that that timeout and token loss, which I would consider to be punishment procedures, those would not be allowable, or?
Not that they should never be used, but under circumstances where you try to use differential reinforcement or other reinforcement procedures first. I think that we got into this debate, I think, in like BCBA supervision, and that technically differential reinforcement, you're reinforcing one response and you're putting another one on extinction. So I think that there's a natural, like, quote unquote, punishment part, because punishment is like decreasing in behavior, but it's making sure some of the adversiveness, like I have a kiddo, for instance, that just hearing the Velcro of that loss, she goes into a lot of problematic behaviors. I mean, it doesn't need to be 30, 40 minutes for a tantrum. So
Look, it's a timeout.
it's a timeout. So for this particular person, because loss of a token is so aversive and she could engage in, property destruction, such dangerous behaviors, that for her isn't appropriate, but somebody else it may be. But I'm just saying that there's just special considerations to take into
I
to think
appreciate
about.
that.
So that's all.
I appreciate that. In the back?
I just want to say that make sure, because we're from different states, make sure that you know the regulations in your state, and certain states and certain departments don't allow the use of punishment. Whether you believe it as a behavior analyst, it is not always acceptable in behavior plans at certain locations.
So in these states, do they not provide fines for criminal behavior?
Well, just to go along with what they're saying, for those of you who work in Pennsylvania in BHRS, which is our behavioral health, generally they look askance at any form of punishment. They consider response costs to be punishment as well. It's not that you can never do it. You have to show that you made a valiant attempt at using positive reinforcement, and when it was ineffective, you have to give clinical justification for using a punishment.
So let me ask this. I'm naive to this. Sorry? Okay.
In New York State, before you institute a punishment procedure, I believe in punishment as a behavior analyst. So let me start by saying that. But before I write any kind of plan with any kind of punishment procedure, it has to go before an emergency human rights review board.
Okay. Let me just ask this, naively. Do you have to do the same thing for extinction?
No.
So anytime you use differential reinforcement, aren't you also using extinction? So oh yeah, no, I appreciate.
I know in New York State, when we write any kind of plan that has any kind of response cost punish, it's considered a punishment procedure. It just is.
For anyone in Pennsylvania, if you have any questions regarding punishment, you want to check out the PA Code, Chapter 14, and there's explicit verbiage in there that denotes that you need to have exhausted all positive measures before moving into any type of punishment procedure. It is an IEP team decision, and it has to be documented. But as you mentioned, it's really important to know the law across all the states.
I'm from New York also, and they count response cost, overcorrection, and satiation as the restrictive practices that we have to get HRC approval for.
These are just your recommendations for specifically what you just talked about.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally
Yeah.
agree, but just with the confusion over the state, they don't realize extinction, but the other three they do.
So if you implement extinction, response independently, it's okay, but if it's response dependently, it's not, or it falls into a different category. Okay, I'm glad I work in the lab. We don't have to get permission from the pigeons to do this. So I just want to close on by relating this to some broader economic considerations. So when you're dealing with a token economy, it's not simply a matter of one thing working at a time. It's a lot of variables that are interacting together that collectively comprise an economic system, okay? And in my paper, if you're interested in exploring more, I have a whole section on economic variables related to token economies, but I just want to hit a couple of the high points. You want to create a robust economy. Think about your token system as an economy. Create a robust economy by using multiple reinforcers, as we've discussed, frequent exchanges. This is an important thing. To create a robust economy, you want to limit the amount of savings. You want to, like in the economy at large, you want people to spend. You don't want them to put money in the bank. You want them to spend it. That's what a robust economy is. So whenever possible, arrange for conditions where you either require exchanges that don't carry over. In other words, so that students don't have a bank account that they can stockpile tokens. This is going to reduce the efficacy of the token system. And whenever possible, to use a closed economy, okay? And what I mean by that is by making the reinforcers only available within that context. If you're using, let's say, an iPad as access to an iPad as a reinforcer in your token economy, you want to make sure that your student doesn't have free access to the iPad right outside of your session. Okay, that's going to reduce the value of the reinforcer in your token economy. So you want to make sure that these things are available only within the session. And I want to end with probably my favorite token economy paper ever published, and it really incorporates several of these economic considerations. And this was 1972. It was a very special year for token economies. This was a study that was done by McLaughlin and Malaby in a classroom setting. And it basically worked like this. It was a 4th and 5th grade combined class. They instituted a token economy over the entire academic year. Okay, so sometimes published studies on token economies do a little snapshot and then they go away. They do a little intervention, they go away. This was looking at extended behavior over an entire academic year. They targeted spelling, language, math, and handwriting. So just basic academic subjects. Handwriting, not so much these days anymore, but this was 1972 where handwriting was, I remember these, still important. And one of the unique things about this study was that they took already existing reinforcing activities within the classroom and they used those as the reinforcer. So one of the criticisms of token economies is that, well, you've got the cost. You've got to go and buy all of these toys and edibles and things like that are going to serve as your backup reinforcers. The genius of the McLaughlin and Malaby study was that they took already existing reinforcers within the classroom, naturally occurring. This is why they called it intrinsic reinforcement, because it was intrinsic to the classroom setting. They're not talking about it being intrinsic to the kid. It's not inside the organism. It's intrinsic to the whole system. And then these were some of the, so they just had the kids rank their reinforcers. Sharpening pencils. Who knew this would be so valuable? Seeing the animals, taking out the balls. Look at this one, being on a committee. Coming in early, hanging out with the teacher. Yeah, so who knew? But these were the ones that were identified by the kids, and then they assigned prices to these based on their relative reinforcer value. And so the genius was they just took these naturally occurring reinforcers and they just simply restructured them. So now, instead of them happening naturally, they made them contingent on tokens. Okay? No extrinsic reinforcers, no toys, no edibles. It's just naturally occurring reinforcing activities restructured and made contingent on productive academic behavior and classroom behavior. So basically what they did was they had a baseline where they just had traditional practices in place. If the kids didn't finish their assignments, they stayed after school. They had parent-teacher conferences, standard letter grades, and so on. Then they instituted token economy in which points were awarded for good academic performance, assignment completion in these different subjects, and also good classroom behavior. And they had a fixed exchange every 5 days. Okay, so every Monday, the kids got to exchange whatever tokens they had earned that week, the previous week, for these privileges. Then they did a really interesting control. They didn't want to go remove the token system entirely. Oh, wait, sorry. This is Oh, token economy 2. So they did the first version of the token economy was exchange every Monday. So it was a fixed ratio. It was a fixed interval exchange. Actually, it was more like a fixed time exchange. It happened regularly, independent of responding every Monday. And then what they did was they changed it to a variable exchange. So it was unpredictable. It averaged between 2 and 6 days on average. So now they've got the token system in place. It's working, as I'll show you in a bit. Then they needed to demonstrate experimental control. But what do you do when you've got this robust economy, kids working well, academic performance is up, good classroom behavior is up? You don't want to take it away. And so what they did was they arranged what they call a quiet behavior condition, where they continued to produce points or continued to allow for points for good behavior, good classroom behavior, but not for academic performance. Okay, so it's sort of like selectively implementing the token system. So they could keep some part of the token system in place, not have to return all the way to baseline to demonstrate the efficacy of the program. And then they ended on a good note. They ended on the token economy 2 with the variable exchange. And so these show, this is aggregate data. So across all of the kids in the class, across long periods of time, this is the percent of assignments completed in spelling, language, handwriting, and math. Baseline, pretty variable. They implement the token, the fixed exchange token schedule, and they get higher levels of percent completed, but still some variability. Then they go to the token 2, really cleans things up, and they get pretty much very high levels of assignment completion. They go to quiet behavior. The assignment completions drop, right? It's still contingent on good behavior, but not on assignment completion. It drops, and then they implement this, and they get a return, okay? So why do you think they get better performance here than here? It's a little quiz. It's variable, it's unpredictable, right? So they don't know when that exchange is going to come, and so it sustains much higher levels of behavior. So the recommendation here is to restrict or reduce access to reinforcers outside. This is something I mentioned before, closed economy. And also, importantly, to include all of the behavioral programs within the token economy. Okay? So if you're going to implement a token economy and you want it to really work, you want it to be robust, don't have some programs on non-token procedures and some programs on token procedures. It's going to be best. I know that this is maybe a big ask, but wherever possible, it's going to be best to bring all of your programs into the token system. Okay, so it's self-contained, as the McLaughlin-Malaby procedure was. Okay, we've got a couple of minutes, and I just want to sum up with a few comments, and then maybe we'll have a minute or two for questions. So, in summary, basic and applied research on token systems has drifted apart over the years, as I've said, and this, I believe, has had unfortunate consequences for the field. We now know, after 50 years of applied work on token economies, that token systems work. We know that they work. We still have very limited understanding of why they work. What are the variables responsible for their efficacy? This is an area that is ripe for translational research. So by translational research, I'm talking about research that connects basic work in the laboratory to application. And the usual way that translational work develops is it originates in the lab, it has origins in the lab, and then it's extended outward to application. So it's unidirectional. It goes in one direction only. And this is kind of translational model that has served us well. It's served our field well, taken basic principles, applying them to real-life problems. But in the area of token economies, I believe that we can achieve this kind of bidirectional translational research, where the applied research, rather than simply being a vehicle for the extrapolation of basic principles to some applied problem, can actually set the research agenda, where we can take applied issues and return to the lab to study them, to try to better understand why they work and how they work. This is sometimes called use-inspired basic research, where applied issues inspire research into underlying mechanisms. My preferred term is discovery-based applied research. Whatever you choose to call it, the important point is that this is the kind of research that leads with an analysis, trying to understand how and why things work, rather than simply that they do. And when this kind of discovery-based applied work is done in an applied context, I think we can rapidly advance the science and the application of token reinforcement system. The science the analysis of why it works with the application, trying to figure out how to effectively apply it to problems of social significance. This is where I think I'd like to open it up and invite more of a collaborative approach to this problem, because I think that that progress will be most rapid with an integrated approach, with an eye toward analysis and with a foot in the applied realm, where we can have constructive dialogues across these different settings. This is where I think that the progress in token economies will be most successful with this kind of integrated approach. So this is where I look to you all for ideas, and you're the ones that are actually implementing these things where the rubber meets the road in the real world, and I think that I'd really like to try to further develop this kind of dialogue between those of us who work in the lab and those of you who are working in the real world. So let me thank you for your attention. I'll stop here, and then we can entertain some questions. So thank you. This is my email address if you want to further this conversation. I know it's late. I know it's the very end of the week, so we may just want to break, but we've got 5 minutes if anybody wants to ask questions.
I need a microphone. Can everybody hear me?
It's being live.
Oh, I'm so sorry.
I'm just wondering if there is any experimental work where the reinforcer is not known to the participant, like a mystery, what's behind door number 2?
No.
Okay. I find for some students, like the element of surprise is really effective in an applied setting. It's like sometimes kids are like, yeah, I know what you have to offer, I don't care. But if I have a mystery box, they're like, ooh. Does anyone else have that experience?
That's very interesting. There's some where, as we've discussed, where the requirements for reinforcement are unpredictable, or even the amount. Okay, I must have said something wrong. See, it worked. I stopped talking. But the actual reinforcer being unknown, no, I don't know of any, but it's an interesting idea. Did you have a thought?
I just thought, given that reinforcement,
Here comes the mic.
one of the important dimensions is unpredictability, then, I mean, as long as what you offer in the mystery box is something the child might like, but it kind of makes sense.
It's like not a
So
spider or something, but
Yeah.
things.
Surprise, I mean, many of us kind of, makes sense. I'll use that. Thank you. That's a really good idea.
Yeah, so it's kind of like a generalized reinforcer, right? Because you might have a menu of things that might come up, but it wouldn't be necessarily selected by the student, but it would be unpredictable, the actual reinforcer. It's a really good idea.
Meaning game shows, they do that.
Yeah.
Like you can win this prize or the mystery prize. How many times do they go for the mystery? Because the unknown is so.
Yes. I mean, it really ties into that kind of preference for variable, unpredictable outcomes. But those are usually varied along either a delay or amount, but not, the thing itself. Yeah, it's a good idea.
When you isolated, in that study where you isolated the effect of the loss using the yoked reinforcement rate, have you yoked the loss to the exchange rate in the loss condition to the exchange rate in the gain-only condition to see if the loss it would receive a different magnitude of reinforcement than the gain rate, but still receive the same exchange rate? Does that question make sense? No.
Because the reason it doesn't make sense is because if you're losing tokens, you're necessarily going to be losing reinforcers. So there's no way to, unless I misunderstood your question.
So yoking it to the exchange frequency. So there would be a different magnitude. But
yoking it to the frequency, but not to the magnitude.
Yes, so they'd still get the exchange on the same schedule. And so you just see the effect of the magnitude of the reinforcement, that loss.
Yes, so by using, instead of a ratio exchange, using maybe an interval exchange. So you could have basically the same delays between exchange, but the magnitude. No, we haven't done that, but it's a really good idea. It's a good idea. Thank you. Anything else? Yes.
I used the token economy extensively when I was a special ed teacher with relatively typical kids and grew lazy working one-on-one, so used it much less and just broke up Hershey bars. But when you were asking about extinction, a lot of times in a classroom situation, you'd have one or two individuals seeking negative attention. And they weren't just seeking my attention, but the attention of all their peers. So I just go around the room rewarding the one or two individuals that were ignoring bad behavior and staying on task. And after a little while, everyone was ignoring the negative attention-seeking behavior, and I had a comic playing to a dead room. And it was invaluable in classroom management. Just wanted to share that.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I just want to know if you had any practical advice on how we can help set our variable ratio schedules. Just in that, I kind of find that still is almost like an art to me, and I know it needs to be more of a science. And it's like I kind of do something and then I take data on it, and I'm obviously making decisions that way. But any practical advice on how we can start that process?
So keep the mic because I'm going to ask a follow-up. Do you mean practical guidelines for how you would set it up, or rules for what kinds of schedule variables to use, schedule values to use?
Let's go with option A, door A.
That, I'm not sure. I mean, the recommendation from the lab is to use variable schedules and to make them as dense as possible, okay? But again, you don't want to spend, half of your teaching session in exchange, so you want to balance the, how strong those schedules maintain behavior with how much behavior you're going to try to get in the session.
Right, which is where I find that that's the art.
That's the art, yes. Okay. But the more variable, the better. So I think that you can lean out that exchange schedule so that you're requiring more and more behavior to get to the exchange, provided it's a variable schedule with those unpredictable elements. Thank you. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Tim. Couple announcements. Social work CEUs, those of you that are interested in those CEUs must sign out today. Don't forget to return your yellow form to the registration desk so that you guys can get credit for all your sessions that you attended. If you're interested in providing feedback for this session on the app and or on the pink form, remember that this session was session number 87, and the speaker was Tim Hackenberg. All right, the code you've all been waiting for, THS 100. Again, THS 100. Thank you to everyone that has attended the session here face-to-face and those of you that attended live stream. We will see you at the closing keynote, which starts at 4:30 in the President's Hall. Thank you.